welcome everyone to this podcast presented by the Critical Path Institute. My name is Shelley Steele. I am the eCOA Senior Scientific Advisor at WCG, and I also currently serve as the Industry Co-Director of this Critical Path Institute's Electronic Clinical Outcome Assessment Consortium, more commonly known as the ECO Consortium. I am joined today by Scotty Kern, Executive Director of the ECO Consortium. Today we'll be discussing the use of Bring Your Own Device, or BYOD. We want to discuss approaches for the collection of eCOA data in clinical trials. The podcast will offer a preliminary look at what we've learned from a year-long initiative that is investigating both what is needed to implement BYOD approaches, as well as what can be done to accelerate the adoption of BYOD approaches. Let's begin with an introduction from Scotty. Welcome, Scotty.
So Shelley, thank you for the welcome. I serve as the Critical Path Institute's lead for the eCOA Consortium. The eCOA Consortium was established as the EPRO Consortium by c-path back in 2011. We changed our name quite recently to basically better reflect the capabilities of the members of the consortium and the scope of our interests and the strategic direction of where we're going. Along with c-path, the consortium is a pre-competitive alliance formed from 17 member firms that provide eCOA data collection technologies and services. In essence, the eCOA consortium intends to represent the consolidated voice of the eCOA community. Now, the BYOD project that we're discussing today is one of a number of projects the eCOA consortium is running in collaboration with sponsor organisations that are members of c-path's PRO consortium under an initiative called the eCOA Getting Better Together initiative. Now, this is an initiative that was instigated to identify and address the root causes of issues with eCOA implementation in clinical trials. And it kind of intends to drive real positive and lasting change in the eCOA ecosystem for the benefit of all stakeholders. Now, the BYOD project is ongoing. And under your leadership, Shelley, it has generated a really tremendous amount of debate, investigation, assessment, analysis, and I'm kind of excited really to be here with you to share where we are with the project.
I'm excited as well. Let's begin with the first question. So in the context of electronic eCOA data capture, what does BYOD stand for and how do you define it?
The BYOD stands for Bring Your Own Device, and we define it as the practice of permitting clinical trial participants to use personal devices to capture, record, and transmit data in clinical investigations.
What are some of the benefits of BYOD?
Essentially, it provides a flexible approach. It really offers choice in how data are captured and an approach that may better fit the participant's lifestyle and, of course, the overall study design. In essence, participants get to use the device they are most comfortable with and most familiar with, and it leads to a better overall experience for patients and, as a result, potential improvements in data completeness. It's a convenience thing. To use their own device, there's something that is always close to hand and not having to carry what's traditionally been a second additional device around with them to work at home in order to participate in a clinical trial.
Great. Can you describe some of the considerations around choosing to implement BYOD in a study?
So for me, there are 4 general categories for these considerations for BYOD implementation. The first is fairly obvious, ensuring that all participants have access to a device, typically a smartphone, as we all know, and that will support eCOA data collection, whether that device is personally owned by the participant or provisioned to them. Now, the general discussion nowadays is that we want to try and get to that 100% BYOD, but ultimately, typically we're using hybrid approaches where we can provision the device to those participants that do not have one that's appropriate for use in the trial, or crucially, if they elect not to do so, they don't want to use their own device for a whole range of reasons. The second consideration is around really being aware of the requirements of the authors or copyright holders for clinical outcome assessment measures. There are extremes to the expectations that some measure owners have, and it ranges from requiring review of the measures as displayed on several different screen sizes, all the way through to requiring absolutely no review whatsoever at all. Our recommendation really is that we design and review on the smallest screen size that is typically available, but to have validated software packages or technologies that can demonstrate that the measure is able to scale across screen sizes appropriately and has no impact as a result on the use of the system by the participant. The third consideration is based on the fact that amongst the ECOA Consortium membership, they're often asked about the acceptability of BYOD among different age groups. Now, irrespective of age groups and population, the whole concept of BYOD is about making this about individual choice. We should have a study design or a plan in place that if a participant chooses to use their own device or a provision device, it can be accommodated. So, for example, if a site has at least one provision device available, a patient can come into the site for enrollment and be asked if they would want to use their own device or not, and then we can make sure that we include that that participant's own preference as part of the pre-screening process. Now, in terms of the evidence around giving that sense of comfort of the acceptability of BYD approaches, particularly in older age groups, the ECOA Consortium, in its former guise as the EPRO Consortium, collaborated with the PRO Consortium on a manuscript that is currently under peer review for future publishing. And this paper details the findings of a crossover study that compared the use of a BYOD approach to provision devices in older patients with COPD. What the results showed, and looking forward for that to become public in the very near future, a very high level of comfort with those technology types, and in fact, a slightly higher overall compliance where BYOD was used. And the fourth and final consideration is really to assess where there may be a perception of or a need for additional site training, or if there's additional site burden involved in a BYOD approach. Now, there's a lot more BYOD studies happening than is immediately apparent. An increasing use of BYOD is expanding the understanding and knowledge amongst our member firms and sponsors as well. While there may be additional considerations for sites in terms of supporting BYOD, it doesn't appear from the evidence we've obtained to impose any significant additional burden when compared to provision models. Often, for everything with a clinical trial, it's often about preparation and ensuring any additional steps are outlined in site-facing training materials. For example, if a participant has a phone that's not suitably modern enough to take part in the trial to be used in a BYOD approach, the site would equip them with one and also give guidance on how to use that provision device to onboard the participant into the eCOA system. Different providers take different approaches of just maybe providing a device, a smartphone, which the participant can use, or they may actually have the application installed on the device. One preparation learning that we've identified in some of our discussions is a key one: to ensure participants know their App Store password in advance of coming in for enrollment. And the sites can support the process of accessing the relevant App Store and installing the app, but that becomes a little tricky if they can't get into the App Store themselves. Now, once the app is actually installed and is accessed by the participant, it's essentially the same as using a provision device. And that includes going through any working training module to orientate the participant on what they're expected to do with the app or the system as a whole. And if I may, I'd actually, Shelley, like to direct listeners to the ECOA Consortium's webpage, where we've published a guide to best practices for participant registration in clinical trials using BYOD, and that might provide some further direction to the listeners.
So, Scotty, where do you think we are in terms of adoption of BYOD approaches in clinical trials?
And we all know and we recognise that the clinical development community is traditionally conservative and has often lagged over the years other industries in terms of adoption of new technology and practices. But over the last few years, we've seen a very positive shift towards the use of more patient-focused approaches, such as BYOD in clinical trials. And of course, what we've been dealing with globally over the last 2 years has obviously had an impact on this uptick in adoption. And it's opened up this willingness to explore more readily some approaches to clinical trial execution that we might not have considered so significantly in the past. And pivotally, we've also built up a wealth of evidence, both in terms of individual and institutional experience and also within published literature that addresses many of those questions that ECO Consortium members get asked around equivalence, adoption rates, technical considerations, and of course, data privacy. And while we do remain behind the curve compared to other industries, we are certainly at a place where the desire to use approaches such as BYOD has become greater than the apprehension.
Yeah, speaking about questions that I frequently get, one I often get is, do you feel that there's still a need for further equivalence testing?
We've seen a substantial amount of evidence produced that supports the fact that migration of a paper measure to an electronic format does not meaningfully impact how the participant responds to the items when and only when the process of faithful migration is followed. It is also essential that established best practices around EPRO design and implementation are followed as well. Now, incidentally, in support of that, the ECO Consortium is currently working on a new paper that will consolidate all migration best practices into a single document and provide additional guidance on migration where newer features are available within ECO systems. Our aim is for that paper to be published later this year. But to expand on your real question, Shelley, on that issue of equivalence, member firms from across the ECO community have run and repeated measurement comparability studies and conceptual equivalence work time and again. And there are several meta-analysis papers out there that firmly support the notion that if, as we said, a faithful migration is performed and design best practices are adhered to, concerns over equivalence are no longer valid. That the focus really has to be on using the right measure in the right context. Some examples of the published evidence out there include a paper by Bill Byram et al. Back in 2018 that demonstrated measurement equivalence across electronic modes and device types. And also the previously mentioned BYOD versus provision device study run in COPD patients by the ECO Consortium and the PRO Consortium in 2017 demonstrated equivalence between BYOD and provision device completion. That accompanying paper is currently under consideration for publication, and when it does get out there, it will provide another piece of compelling evidence that supports BYOD approaches and navigates us through the mindset of demanding or expecting further equivalence testing. In our opinion, this really all comes back to the chosen eCOA system being fit for purpose. And if the conclusion of the sponsor and eCOA provider is that the BYOD approach is the most appropriate, then it should be used. And of greater value, though, is, as we said, ensuring that the actual measures themselves selected are fit for purpose. As we've seen, the mode of data collection should not impact this, and this is very much in line with the conversations that the project team had with a representative of the FDA, who provided valuable consultative input to the BYOD working group.
So then why do you think sponsors are reticent about using BYOD?
We believe there's a misconception here that sponsors are genuinely not in favor of a BYOD approach. Certainly in the early days of BYOD, there were concerns, valid concerns around the willingness of regulators to accept data that was generated from BYOD systems, and also the other aspects of implementation of this approach, like the suitability of the technology, the risk or perceived risk of loss of data, data privacy, and other aspects. But given the actual number of studies that have been run using BYOD to date, the tone of that discussion has changed. And we believe that there's far lower reticence out there than might actually be the case. Across the clinical research community, we've had that opportunity to see what technology can do for us and the benefits that can bring to data capture within a clinical trial setting. And let's be honest, we had a very similar journey when eCOA first arrived on the scene back in the turn of the century. which is back when I had my own first encounter with what was termed an e-diary. And with that increased level of familiarity, the conversation has turned to what are the next steps forward? What can we do to progress this approach? We're now asking how we can use technology to pave the way for decentralized trials to become an embedded standard approach. And BYOD would very naturally be at the core of that. And another thing in terms of this perception of resistance are the assumptions that, as we said earlier, the owners or developers or license holders of COA measures being apparently resistant to the use of BYOD themselves. That's a position that we see is changing, is evolving, and often measure owners just wish to be consulted with to allow them to ensure their instruments are being used in the right way and that their intellectual property is being protected. And in the end, as we said earlier, it comes down to sponsors and eCOA providers engaging together early and collaborating on what the best approach might be for a study. Some measure owners may wish to be involved, and again, early engagement is key. But these conversations between the right stakeholders can work towards breaking down the assumptions of where the challenges truly lie. You need to assess each study on its merits and decide in collaboration which approach best fits the needs of the study and the population. Of course, there's many factors involved there, like therapy area, trial population, as we said, maybe countries involved. But ultimately, a group approach will get to the right outcome. One thing worth highlighting, Shelley, just to wrap this question up, is that concerns over completion rates being inferior via BYOD to those where provision devices are used, possibly being driven by things like user deactivation of notifications on their own device, which are there to support compliance management. And those concerns appear to be unfounded. Evidence shows to us that completion rates are at least similar between the two approaches.
As far as your work, Scotty, have there been any submissions to the FDA using data captured by BYOD?
Now, this is a core issue. Now, what we can say that is in the public domain is that there is at least one COVID vaccine trial of over 43,000 participants that employed a BYOD approach that was submitted and supported emergency use authorization from FDA, EMA, and over on my side of the pond, MHRA. And amongst the ECO Consortium member firms, we know there have been more COVID-19 studies, both for vaccines and also for COVID-19 treatment research. And they have collected data using BYOD approaches. It's just not in the public domain, and that the ownership of making that available in the public domain does not sit with eCOA providers. In addition, we know of a number of studies in other therapeutic areas that have used BYOD as the method for data capture, but again, we are unable to publicly reference them yet. We have an active survey actually within the project team that was initially issued to the sponsors within the PRO consortium that intends to gather details on the experience with BYOD within sponsors and also any BYOD data related submissions. We will be sharing these data later in the year as part of the project. And if any of the listeners would like to get involved and actually respond to the survey, there will be a link to that survey within the social media posts that promote this podcast. We need wider opinion, and the more opinion we get, the more informed a picture we develop. One thing I think is important for me to share, Shelley, I guess from a personal perspective, but really on behalf of the eCOA Consortium, is that the consortium stands ready to provide or create and maintain a repository of references to BYOD eCOA studies if we can get that data. We are working within the consortium with one of our more visionary eCOA Consortium colleagues on what that might look like right now. And amongst the BYOD project team, we feel that if we can get that experiential data into one publicly accessible place, the resistance to BYOD as a default approach will dissolve.
So, Scotty, what are the next steps for the project?
So, Shelley, as we said, this project is still ongoing and we have much more ground to cover. We do look forward to getting that experiential information from sponsors and CROs via the survey. I look forward to sharing that, and that will inform a lot of where we go next. But crucially, I think it's important to share that both the eCOA Consortium and PRO Consortium members are driven to break down those barriers to BYOD adoption, not just for ePRO data capture, but eCOA data capture more widely. If we can share more evidence and break down those unfounded doubts about DYOD, then we are really ultimately doing a service to those most important people in clinical research, the patients.
Thank you, Scotty, for sharing those perspectives. And like you, I really look forward to seeing the output of this project help deliver the changes that we really want to see.
Thank you very much, Shelley, for your help in making this podcast happen, and also to WCG for hosting the podcast for us.